and our archaeologist, Ashley Jones, who's also a member of the HIS board, is going to talk on cultural resource management archaeology. And this is really important for our members because we dig with so many of the CRM firms. It's important for us to have all the information. So, hey, Ashley, thank you very much. I'm gonna click ours up. I think that's it. All right, we're gonna put on our screen now. And I wanna tell you a little bit about this program that Lewis is going to do. It's about household artifacts and other artifacts in the Big Bend. Now, many of you know that Lewis and I have been traveling together since 1998. And one of the things we've done is done a ton of exploring down in the border villages of the Big Bend. The artifacts you see in this show, to me, are amazing. But the most amazing part is they're still there. What we do when we find these artifacts is we take pictures, we come home, we research them, and what's really gratifying to us is we may go back to a place 2 or 3 years later and the artifacts are still there. So people are really abiding by the rules of don't pick anything up. But we wanted to show this to you because the Big Bend isn't just all about paddling the rivers or hiking on the trails. It's about the humans that live down there. And I'm sure a lot of you know that these border villages that we're going to talk about, when the Big Bend became the Big Bend, all of the villages down there were destroyed. And Lewis will give you more information about that. So Lewis, you're on.
Okay, well, I hope everybody knows who I am. And if not, I'm Lewis Albeck, and I'm here with the president of the organization. We're going to go out to the Big Bend. You can see this map where it is. If you haven't been out to the Big Bend, please go as soon as possible. So as soon as the park reopens, it's now closed.
And it's not 110 degrees.
And yes, I checked. It's only 105 in Terlingua this afternoon, so it's a pretty warm thing during the summertime.
Hey, Lewis, I'm sorry to interrupt you. It's Liz. Right now, what I see is end of slideshow, click to exit.
Oh.
Is what?
Start your slideshow over. If it's supposed to be on the map, it's not on it.
Oh, okay.
What do you see now?
End of slideshow, click to exit. It may still be hung up on your last set of slides.
Okay, let me exit that one. Okay, I've got to share this screen then?
Yes, yes, you got it.
All right. Okay.
All right, Liz out.
Close that. Is it
okay,
can you see it now?
Now what do you see?
Yep, you got it. Looks good.
Okay, so we're going back out to the Big Bend now. And of course, everybody should be familiar with West Texas and the Big Bend National Park being right down at the bottom of the Big Bend. We, over about a decade, beginning in the late 1990s, maybe early 2000s, we spent a decade surveying these border villages. The first thing we had to do was find out where they were, and they're not generally available to people who don't get off of the paved road. Many of them are in the back country, and you have to find them out. The Park Service in the 1950s decided that these villages were too modern and they bulldoze them, or if they're in the back country, they let them go back to nature, so to speak. So we hunted those down, and we've visited about 30 plus backcountry sites. And let me give you a little background of the backcountry sites. The Big Bend was a despoblado all the way up until the last part of the 19th century. That meant that nobody lived there because of the Indian predations. The Comanches and the Apaches would raid through the Big Bend area and destroy everything. So generally speaking, there were no people living permanently in the Big Bend. But in the late 70s, the US Army finally put all of the Indians back on the reservations. And when they did that, the people started coming back into the Big Bend. The Southern Pacific built the Transcontinental Railroad right through Alpine and Marathon. And you could go from California to Houston on one railroad track. And this really brought people into the Big Bend. And these people were, believe it or not, mining people, because there is a lot of mineral resources in the Big Bend. They were making wax factory operations to produce candelilla wax, which was a very profitable wax for things like lipstick. Linda likes to know that. And other things. They're more synthetic waxes today, but that was in the mid to late 20th century. The candelilla wax was a very profitable business. So you saw those people coming in, and you had ranchers developing ranch activities through the Big Bend as well. Now, what's not told is that with all of these industrial and mining types of operations, you needed a lot of people to work on these projects, the worker bees. And unfortunately, as we researched the history of the Big Bend, most of the historical details were about the owners of the businesses, the Anglo settlers, and they didn't mention much about the working people, but they were there. And from about 1890 all the way until the time of the establishment of the Big Bend National Park in 1942, there was a very large strip of economic activity along the river. And it went all the way from Boquillas, which is on this map on your right-hand side. It doesn't work very well. All the way around to over near Terlingua Creek or Santa Elena Canyon on the left-hand side. We have marked in here some of the sites that we have surveyed. And within this group of sites, we have selected 9 of these villages to examine. Let me see what my next slide is. We did this over 10 years with a small core of people. Everybody probably knows John Rich. He's a member of the Archeological Society. And of course, Linda Gorski and myself. And the 4th person is Dana Enos, a longtime canoeing friend of ours, a former NASA engineer. He worked for Martin Marietta and all kinds of good things, but he is one of the most outstanding outdoorsmen I've ever met. And he's probably the only person I know who hiked the Pacific Coast Trail alone. So that was in his younger days. He's retired now. He's retired from being an active participant of ours because he's 92 years old and doesn't get out as much as he used to. Anyway, this crew went out with us over a period of 10 years to survey these sites. When we began, we only thought we would go and look at the ruins of the villages. And this is what we found in most of those places. These are 3 of the typical little settlements in the river basin that we surveyed. And going clockwise around from the upper left is La Coyota site. It's actually right on the paved road, but the growth over it is so thick that unless you know what you're looking for, you'll never find it. And then the next one over here is a site with these large timbers that provided the roof for this structure. This was what we call the Molinar site. It has a more official name, but we used our own names so that we would know what we're talking about. But if other people heard us or saw what we were presenting, they wouldn't know exactly where to go look for the stuff. And so it was kind of a means to protect the sites. And then the last one on the lower bottom left here is the El Ojito site. You can see the different types of building construction techniques. We actually gave a presentation to the Center for Big Bend Studies on these building structures. There are what they call, it's a type of native architecture, and that's not the right term, but I can't think what the right term is. Anyway, we gave a presentation on those, but then what we realized was that there were people who lived there, and what was their life like? And the reason that came up was because as we walked around these sites, we saw that artifacts were spread all over the ground. And so we started taking pictures of them and trying to capture the types of artifacts that there are. Now, these are the two areas where we are looking at, villages in these two areas, one on the east side of Mariscal Mountain and one on the west side over near Terlingua Creek. And as I said, we were looking at providing names for them. These are the names that we have given them, some of which, like the San Vicente, is a modern name, but I dare you to find the town of San Vicente today, since it was bulldozed in the 50s, and you have to really know where to look to find the ruins. And some of the other sites are more obvious, but you still have to know where to go. So we're going to look at the artifacts from these 9 sites. I think I have over 200 artifacts in this slideshow. So when we get to that part, we're going to blow through it pretty quick because I don't think you want to be here until midnight. But we'll talk a little bit about some of the overriding themes as we look at these artifacts. So now, as we did our historical studies, we realized that hardly anybody mentioned the people who lived in these villages along the border, except one person, and that was a fellow named W.D. Smithers. You can see his name at the bottom of this picture. He wrote a couple of books on these people, but he was a photojournalist for the San Antonio Express. And his area of expertise was the Big Bend. He had worked actually with the U.S. Army during the 19-teens. He was a mule driver is what he was. But he came back and spent most of his career documenting the people of the Big Bend area. And he has in his book 2 photos. We're going to show the first one here. And this is a jacal near the Glen Springs area. It was taken about 1920. And this is a very small little accommodation. It's not a very fancy one, but it's not atypical of some of those in the Big Bend. And what we like about it is that this family is at breakfast. The wife is fixing breakfast for the husband and the kids. And as is typical in the Big Bend, your life is lived out of doors. It's not uncommon to set up everything outside. Your little house is basically a shelter for inclement weather. From this picture, though, we were able to identify the objects that we were finding. What we were finding are objects that have been crushed, broken, and fallen to pieces. But now we can see how the families in these villages, how they actually use them. And you can see wash tubs and basins, coffee pots, coffee cups, just all kinds of ordinary utilitarian pieces. There's even a little teapot over here. We have tools over on the left-hand side. You have a shovel, got a broom and an axe, big wash tub on the left. And these are the kinds of things that we realized we were seeing. And now we, can put 2 and 2 together. Okay. Linda tells me that term I was trying to figure out was vernacular architecture. Thank you. That's why she's on the team. The other picture, did I hear people laughing out there? The other picture is of an interior house. This is you might say, the next level up in the home scale. This is the home of a family that we actually know the name of, the Holdwin family. And they lived on a small hill known as Sierra Chino. And you say, what does Sierra Chino mean? It means the Chinese mountain, but it was named for the chino grass that grows on that mountain. But we can see the interior of this house. It's much well organized, much better organized. And again, though, it has just all of the artifacts that we're finding out on the land in the fashion that it was used. You can see here next to the door some food products on the table, pots and pans and basins. Over here on the stove, this is a wood burning stove in the center. You can see pots and pans. In the cabinet there on the right-hand side, you see pitchers, plates, dishes, your tableware, and so forth. And then on the right-hand side, you see a Dutch oven hanging from that little rafter. And just behind it, you can see the lantern. So this was a very, I'd say, a relatively prosperous family in the Big Bend area. Again, this was about 1920, which is right at the beginning, I guess, of the time period that we're looking at, maybe a little in the middle of the time period. So do you want to say something?
No.
So we took and organized the artifacts in these categories so that we could kind of get a feel for what they are. And we're going to go through these fairly quickly and just highlight some of the things that we were looking for. Essentially, what we wanted to do was identify the time period that these artifacts were introduced to this area. Also, we wanted to be able to see, recognize what they were, because they're in terrible shape, as you'll see. But since we had the photos, we're able to look at those. And so we're going to go ahead and start on this. We're going to put up a little display of lots of the buckets and wash basins. You can see they're all over the place in all types of conditions. But I do want to show some of them a little closer. Your typical 2-gallon bucket. These are everywhere. They were probably, one of the top 10 utensils that they needed to work. And a lot of that comes from having to bring water to your house. So these were.
And one of the things I want to point out is at a lot of these villages, it seriously is like the people got up and walked away. That's how much stuff is left behind,
Exactly.
How many artifacts are left behind. It's truly remarkable.
Well, they broke them first,
Right.
and then they. And of course, the ubiquitous 15-gallon wash tub. If you grew up at the time I did, your grandmother probably had one of these anyway. I actually have my grandmother's wash tub in my backyard. I used to wash my dog in it. But they were very common for the same reason. If you needed to take a bath, you needed a lot of water, and so wash tubs are very good. So now we'll move on to a little more of the utilitarian ware, the enamel ware and granite ware. Enamel ware, I think it developed in the mid to late 19th century, and it's basically you made a steel plate or dish or whatever, and you coated it with enamel. Very inexpensive, but super durable. And so this was very common. If you remember those two photos, most of their pots and pans and plates were enamel ware. So we'll take a look at a few of these. Wash basins. These are absolutely necessary for a lot of reasons. And the upper one here is your typical blue-gray granite thing. But what we did find are there variations of the enamel pattern, sort of to give a little different style. This is sky blue on white, but you'll see navy blue on white, green on white, and other features. Your standard coffee pot, just like the one that your grandma had for sure. Actually, I've got one of myself like that. with the coffee ground thing. And of course, the tableware, your plates, coffee cups, and this is a serving spoon. It's a large spoon, the handle's missing. But you can see these are just basic dining room type of utensils. Again, a few others, a large pot. You've seen these lids, same thing, enamelware. And it's like a 1 quart pan, same thing, enamelware. You find this stuff in all of the villages. It's very sort of what you might refer to as the base for all of these homesteads. One more, one of my favorites here. You can see we call it a colander, but I think it began life as maybe a dish or a wash basin, but they realized they needed to drain something. So these people were very inventive. They punched holes in the basin and it became a colander. So let's look at a few of the other kitchen items. We found a lot of those. Dutch ovens, believe it or not, are one of the most common of the cooking utensils in these areas. The ovens, you can see on the lower left here, it has a little leg so that they could put coals underneath the Dutch oven. And if you look at the one on the top left here, you see that the rim is raised so you could put coals or I doubt that they use charcoal. They probably just use coals from a fire on top and the bottom, and then you could bake. In these Dutch ovens, you can bake anything that you cook in your modern day kitchen. And we have 3 examples. These are all separate ones. They come in sizes like 10-inch diameter, 12-inch, and 14. And they were very useful in these areas. 1913, the Kerr Glass Company started making these jars for storage. This on the lower left here is a modern one, just so you know what they look like. This is a 1915 vintage. But what we find are the broken pieces of them. So we know they were using a lot of Kerr jars in the areas. A grinding stone. I don't have a scale on this, but this is a very small grinding stone. And if you ever watch the cooking shows, especially those catering to Mexican dinners, they always say, get your little metate and grind the spices. And I'm sure that's what they were doing with this. So when you've got your kitchen, you notice in that second photo, we talked about, looked like some food products over on the table. These are very basic. These are the kinds of products you would have in your pantry. One of the important one was baking powder. We have 2 brands here, the Clabber Girl baking powder. It was originally introduced about 1923, but the earlier one is KC, and you'll see KC, we have 2 KCs here. KC baking powder was also very common, they, just like today, they come in a small can, and you use it as you need it, especially if you're making pancakes or tortillas or whatever you were doing that needed a little bit of a elevation. Also, we had flour things. You see a container up here. This is white swan flour, the one up on the upper left, introduced about 1906. And one of the things that I'm concerned about is when do these products show up in the marketplace? So some are very early in the period of time we're looking at, and others tend to be later. One of the other important items you'd have on your shelf was a little Eagle brand condensed milk. You know, sometimes you needed milk for that food, and so Eagle brand, which is very common today, you can go to Kroger and buy it as well. They were using it in the Big Bend. And my favorite here for your stock of goodie stuff is Karo syrup. This is a 5-pound jug. I'm not sure how pounds convert to gallons, but it was probably a pretty good jug. And in the old days, Karo syrup was introduced about 1900, but it was introduced to the grocery store or to the store in town in a barrel, and you took your jug in, and he filled your jug from his barrel and charged you for it. So we find these big Cairo jugs quite a bit. And of course, there were soda waters and German soda waters to drink. The beer bottle, brown bottle, 1930 or later. But more important is the Circle A ginger ale. It was originally established in 1884 by a fellow named Robert Lazenberry, I believe that was his name. He established the Circle A ginger ale business, and it actually became the largest selling soda water in the United States during the 19th century. But in 1885, Mr. Lazenby decided he'd add another product to his line, and he brought in a product that was called Dr. Pepper Phosphorates. And 20 years later, he changed the name of the company to the Dr. Pepper Company. The ginger ale was phased out by 1940, but we still find these in the Big Bend area. Plenty of snacks. You had sardine cans and little Hershey's chocolate cans, very typical in there. So one of the major things that we were finding were fragments of ceramics. And so we've got a couple classes here. The first class is pottery. And we can just look at some of these. We have stoneware crocks, very typical 6-gallon stoneware crock, probably used to maybe to make cheese or butter. I assume they had cattle and goats. The one with the blue, yeah, we know they had goats. The one with the blue glaze is perhaps a little bigger than 6 gallons, but we only have the fragments, so we don't really know. We have this earthenware, not so much for cooking and stuff, I don't think, but I think more in terms of decorative pottery. This one on the lower left looks very very Mexican style pottery, flower pot maybe, I don't know. The one on the right though has intrigued me ever since we found it. You can see the artistic styling on this. This is very atypical of the Big Bend, and I'm suspicious that it might be something that came in from New Mexico or Arizona or some of those pottery working places. We haven't figured that out yet. Lots of personal items, as you know, people drop things all the time, and so we have quite a few. Let's just take a look at some of them. We have belt buckles, buttons, pins, and of course hair curlers. You all remember those hair curler stuff. All you women remember those, I hope. Lots of medications. You know, you're miles and hours, even today, from medical help. And so these people were very conscious of having their own personal supply of ointments and medications. The upper left one is a St. Joseph's aspirin bottle. That's very early, 1865. It's very common to have. If we go a little farther, we have aceite mexicano, which was a Mexican oil, which was a very common remedy for, you could take it for indigestion, or it also worked if you spread it on your arms in case you had bug bites or something. And so it was a general purpose medication. And then you know about mentholatum. I was surprised to know that mentholatum's been around since 1894. And it was for the, you know, these were people working outside, and so they often had to soothe the pain in their muscles and hands. And then the final one is very recognizable, the Vicks Vapo Rub. It was developed in 1905. It's a combination of menthol and petroleum jelly. And they found that if you had a stuffed sinus, you can put that on your nose and it would clear that up, or rub it on your chest. And it was really a good medicinal thing. We'll tell a quick story. We were reading in the paper just the other day about Camp Logan and the Spanish flu. And the article talked about how when the flu started, that everybody went to the drugstore and bought all of the Vicks VapoRub. So I guess that was the toilet paper of the Spanish flu era. And the manufacturer was saying they would have plenty more available. More products. This this is McLean's volcanic oil. It's a liniment. If you've got sore arms, you've been working in the fields all day and you got sore arms. That's a great stuff. The Chattanooga medicine bottle here. The Chattanooga Medical Company produced a product called the Wines of Cardui. It was a medicine that was 38 proof, and it was said to cure all of the female ailments. And so the major customer of this medication were women, and they could go to the drugstore and buy it rather than trying to sneak down to the bar. I'm sure it just was a good alcoholic beverage. Also, ponds, very common even today. And the last one over on the right is kind of interesting. It's called Hoyt's Nickel Cologne. And it was a cologne made in the back east, I think in Massachusetts. And the nickel part comes from the fact that that little bottle cost a nickel. They also had a Hoyt's 15-cent cologne with a little bigger bottle. So just some interesting personal items. Tobacco tins, votive candles, these are very common across the area. And so also we had to we did locate a lot of tools. The men were working in the area and used a lot of tools. So let's take a look at some of those. We mentioned the lanterns. The Dietz Company was one of the major suppliers of these lanterns. You can see on the right-hand side, this is a beginning of the 20th century model, which is very typical of what we see in the ruined ones here. We had a lot of farm tools. They were doing farming, and they also generally had goats and some cattle and sheep. And so you have sheep shears, you have farm tools, hoes, shovels, axe handles. But the one that really puzzled us for a while until we finally figured it out was the A.H. Patch corn sheller. And you can see from the graphic on the right-hand side how it worked. We had this shell and it was hard to figure out or envision. But from the graphic, you took the device and you clamped it onto a barrel. And then you took your ear of corn, and cranked it down through the throat, and it took all the corn kernels off and left you a cob that you could then throw away. It's surprising they did grow corn in the river floodplain, because it needs a lot of water, but they were able to grow it and use that. A lot of equipment from in the fields, and some of the most interesting was the horse equipment, horseshoes, of course, and these belt tighteners. But the most interesting one that we found was this snaffle bit. If you're a horse person, you know that snaffle bits are very common. The lower one is a modern one. You find it in the catalogs. It costs less than $10. But the one that we found was a homemade one using a little baling wire and what appears to possibly be 2 square nails. I'm not sure, but they were very ingenious people, and they could adapt to what they needed, and we picked that up. So let's get into some of the vast amount of ceramics we have. You can see this whole screen is full of transferware and various types of ceramic pieces.
And I think what surprised us is some of this stuff is very sophisticated. And mind you, all of it was found down in the villages along the border. but very sophisticated, I think.
Exactly. That is probably the most surprising thing. You can see this gives you a good overview. We'll look at some of them more closely, but you have semi-porcelains and some very beautiful designs, very nice flower decoration, and even some real porcelain, and we'll get to those here. They're just basic transfer patterns. We don't have maker's marks on these, so if you don't recognize the pattern, you just say it looks nice because you don't know how it got there. Also, the floral patterns, very decorative. We think some of these are actually porcelain over here on the right-hand side, but surprisingly beautiful tableware that you do not expect in these primitive, what we would think of as primitive housing. Some very nice small pieces, maybe some child's types of pieces as well. And then, of course, most of the work is semi-porcelain. You know that dates from about the first part of the 19th century. It was very popular in England. They imported a lot. And then we started doing that in the United States. And so by 1900, a lot of the material, a lot of the dishware is this very nice looking, but very moderately priced semi-porcelain ware. And so we have a bunch that have maker's marks. And this is the one we want to look at because we can now start talking about time periods of when these materials come into the border villages. Now, the first one I want to point out, which was surprising to me, but I guess now that we know a little more, maybe it isn't, but we found this almost complete blue willow pattern at one of the sites. Now, explain to me how a Chinese motif fits into a border village that's mostly Mexican or Mexican heritage. But this is a very typical one. We do not have a maker's mark on this, so I don't know exactly who supplied it, but if I had to guess, I'd say Homer Laughlin. He was a major producer of the blue willow pattern in the United States. So this one also was kind of a shocker. We had 3 instances of this type of dinnerware from the Petrus Regu company. They were founded in 1850 from Maastricht, the Netherlands, and they're shipping this stuff all the way to the end of the world, it would seem, into the Big Bend. This company operated well into the 20th century, and you can see their maker's mark is very distinct with the Sphinx. They actually changed the name of the company to the Sphinx name in 1899. We have this Durward pattern, which was produced by the W.S. George Company. Again, very early, 1904, and this is from Pennsylvania and Ohio. On the right-hand side, you see what the dish looked like. It's also semi-porcelain. It's not porcelain. The Wellsville Pioneer Pottery Company, Wellsville, Ohio. Note the dates again, 1896. They're out of business 1902, very early in the period. The Vaudrey brothers, there's actually 3 brothers in that group. Again, 1896, and they're out of business in 1929. It's, again, semi-porcelain. Pope Gosner Company, Coshocton, Ohio, 1902. You can see there on the right-hand side how nice the patterns were on these pieces. And then the Cook Pottery had their Meller and Company brand. I think they made a fancy maker's mark to make it look European, but it came from Trenton, New Jersey, so take it with a grain of salt. Again, very early, they could have been producing this at the beginning of the 20th century, and they were out of business by the 26th. And George Murphy and Company, East Liverpool, Ohio, again, very early, 1894 to 1904. So a lot of this, this tableware is coming in very early. Now, this is the one that, again, was kind of a shocker. You don't expect to find Noritake china in the Big Bend area. You can see from this maker's mark where it says hand painted over the top, and in the center it's the rising sun mark. You have to look at it really closely. And below it, it says Nippon. That maker's mark was stopped being used in 1921. So we know that this fine china was coming over very early in the period. On the right-hand side, you have a typical example. And our last one here, well, I think it's our last one, Homer Laughlin. Homer Laughlin started his company in 1870. The company is still in existence. It's one of the largest makers of dinnerware, pottery in the United States. So we found some of his stuff. Now, his story is kind of interesting. He was probably the biggest seller of ceramics in the United States during the first half of the 20th century because of his good marketing. He sold his very modestly priced pieces through the F.W. Woolworth Company. He had deals with the American Cereal Company, and if you bought a box of Mother's Oats, you got a bowl inside. And the one article I saw said that they could barely keep up with enough bowls to get them into the oatmeal boxes. And then finally, he sold his pieces through the Sears and Roebuck catalog. Now, remember, the railroad went through to Marathon. The mines shipped mercury in vials up to the train station at Marathon. They went every day. And instead of coming back empty, the freighters usually brought back shipments that came in for people in the area. So Sears and Roebuck probably was one of the big customers shipping things to the people in the border villages. So the other big collection that we have are munitions. I call it firearms, but what we really have are the shell casings from the firearms. And we're not going to go through all of them. I wanted to make just one general comment about them. We found these across every village. And the thing that bothered me the most was we very rarely found duplicates. It seemed like everybody had to have a different type of weapon. And I'm not sure why that is. Maybe it's just a coincidence. But we'll look at some of these. They're very identifiable. This casing here, it's a Krag Jorgensen from Norway, but it was a rifle developed for the United States Army in the 1890s. But the rifle did not perform very well in the Spanish-American War, and so it was replaced by the Army. But those, we don't know if this is a casing from perhaps the Army that was in the Big Bend during the Pancho Villa Revolution, 1912, 1914, or not. These weapons existed for years, so we don't know the actual provenance of that casing, but we can always envision it. Now, this is another ancient cartridge. It's a Winchester 44 WCF. That means Winchester centerfire. This was the first centerfire metal cartridge that Winchester made for their Winchester 1873 rifle. If you ever watched the old cowboy shows like I did when I grew up, that Winchester 73 was the gun that won the West. And it was very popular among ranchers, lawmen, cowboys, because you could also use an Army single action revolver that used the same 44 shell. So you could have a rifle and a pistol and only have one type of ammunition. But of course, the the Winchester Company developed other ammunition for the 45 Colt very early again, 1870s. Again, Remington, we have these shotgun shells. These are 12 gauge. You can see this one, because of the maker's or for the stamp, the head stamp, we know it was after 1916. Winchester also had 12 gauge, the new black. This one, from the head stamp, we can tell it dates prior to 1920. So we get a good sample of the time periods of these weapons. Peters develops a rifle very early on in the 19th century, but this cartridge was developed in 1915, and it was made all the way through the 1960s. They also had a 38 caliber, the 3840 shell, and I apologize for the blurry picture, but we were able to identify it anyway. And then finally, we have another Winchester 30 caliber. This was a very popular rifle shell for deer hunters. They claimed that this was the best deer hunting rifle that they had. This WCF mark was used up until 1946. So we know that this shell, or actually these two shells, were during the period that we're looking at. And we have a Winchester 38 Smith & Wesson Special. This was a revolver casing, revolver shell, and it was introduced in 1899, but in 1920, in the 1920s, this became a standard police revolver. This shell was found actually across the street from the customs station at Boquillas. My guess is that there were actually 6 casings sitting on the ground. I think one of the officers went to the restaurant that was there and decided to do some target practice after lunch.
Way back when.
Way back. It was way back when. And we've got one more here, a 32 special Remington cartridge as well, 1911 to 1960. And our last one is kind of an anomaly. This is a Cascade 22 caliber rimfire, but it was not introduced until 1963, over 20 years after the park was established. So somebody was illegally firing his firearm in the park, but we don't know who it is. So anyway, I want to thank you for listening to this. We'd be happy to answer some questions. And what I want to impress upon you is that the sophistication and variety of personal goods and household goods in this border village area of the Big Bend astounded us. And I hope you can see why we were astounded as well.
And the other thing I want to tell you is this presentation, only greatly expanded, is going to be one of the articles in the upcoming issue of that Doug talked about.
In the journal, it'll be in the spring of 2021 journal, the Western Archeology Journal.
And we have spreadsheets and artifact counts and all.
So you'll if that whets your appetite, then you'll just wait a little bit and you'll be able to read the more detailed story.
Thank you. Anybody have any questions?
Let's see. I see Beth has her hand up. Can you type the question for us, Beth? Let's see. Was that Beth, or was that an accident?
I took the
Oh, there's.
They have to unmute themselves.
Well, I don't know that she can. I can unmute her. Oh, here, Beth, I unmuted you. We'll try it that way. You're on, Beth. If you had a question. Whoops, no, you're not on. Okay, let me try that again. Well, Whoops, now I'm unmuting Ashley, sorry. Okay, Beth, you are unmuted. Did you have a question?
No, it was an accident. Well, actually, I do have a question. How did you get to the really remote places? Did they have park roads, or did you have to go?
No, very few of them are.
We hiked
You
in.
had, it was all backcountry hiking,
Okay.
which meant that we also had to backcountry camp so that we didn't waste so much time getting to them. They're in the remote parts of the park.
Uh-huh.
And then you also had to figure out where these were because they're not very obvious. We did a lot of groundwork before we went out each time.
Gosh, what fun. Oh my goodness.
Oh, I know.
It was really wonderful, but we really did a lot of hiking. I mean,
Yeah.
there was a lot of hiking involved.
I'll let you know that we didn't go before October 1st, and we never went after April 30th. It's a wintertime venture.
I think it was 114 out there the other day.
Oh my
Yeah,
gosh.
it's hot right now. You don't want to be in the Big Bend.
You know, the other thing I want to say, and I don't know if Lewis brings this out in the paper that we have coming out in the journal, but Lewis and Dana and I spent 2 whole days at the Harry Ransom Center in Austin looking up these old photos
From the Smithers collection.
From the Smithers collection.
And it's a fabulous collection. And I'm so glad we went, because when the book was published, they were published late in his life and maybe even posthumously. But whoever edited it, they didn't turn the picture over to read his notes because they got the story wrong. And we found that out on a number of those pictures. They had the wrong story. So.
Yeah. But if you're really into the Big Bend, go to the Harry Ransom Center and pull the Smithers collection, and it is fabulous, absolutely fabulous.
All right, any other questions here? Frank had a comment that he put in about the sewing machine that was in one of the pictures.
Right.
His grandmother had a 1900 model, pedal powered.
Don't you have one upstairs?
I have 4 of those in my house, 4 right now, and I use them as bedside tables. So if anybody wants to see a real old sewing machine.